it's time for the PhD flick through. This is where I'm going to flick through my 140,000 word PhD thesis, see where I land, and talk about whatever's on that page. Let's go. This section of my research takes us back to medieval times and are two teeny tiny lead tin rings which were found on the banks of the River Thames in London. And these pieces came courtesy of the Museum of London. Let's read what I have to say about these two pieces. The two tiny finger rings from the Museum of London excavations are constructed from lead tin and date to the 12th or 13th centuries. The rings differ in design as the decoration on one consists of 3 domes, each surrounded by a granulated bezel, whilst the other ring displays a flat diamond-shaped plate decorated at each point with granules. Finger rings are documented to be amongst the most frequently worn articles of medieval jewellery, with cheaper types being specifically referenced to have been worn by the lower classes. As this type of jewellery was generally a representation of those styles worn by the wealthy, the domes and granules on these small examples would no doubt have mimicked the gemstones and other elaborate decoration found within more expensive rings of the time. The Museum of London artefacts are noted to be exact replicas of adult jewellery from the find, so it can be concluded that rings constructed from less expensive materials were commonly worn by medieval children from lower social backgrounds. Now, what's interesting about these finds from the Museum of London is that in another part of my thesis and research, I talk about the types of jewellery worn by children in portraits, and these portraits, typically speaking, showcased the higher social classes because it would only have been people that had a lot of money that could have afforded to have had their portrait painted. And also we have a lot of portraits belonging to people like the royal children. What's interesting about these is that this is considered to be, let's say, the everyday jewellery that the everyday person in London would have been wearing at this time. And there's also evidence that these pieces would have been brightly painted, but of course over time that paint has disappeared. And these tiny examples of that therefore allow me to say that children as well as adults wore this style of jewellery, similarly to how children and adults wore a different style of jewellery in medieval portraits.